Your medicine is poison. She's killing you.
The clock was ticking down. 30 seconds. That's all Zoe had before May would return from her phone call, before everything would go back to normal, and the opportunity to save Jae would slip through her fingers forever. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, her pulse pounding louder than the ticking clock. Her hands were steady, but her heart raced. She leaned in close to Jae, her breath catching in her throat, barely above a whisper. The words that escaped her lips felt like they might be the last thing she'd ever say. Your medicine is poison. She's killing you. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Jae didn't react right away, just staring at her with cold, calculating eyes. His silence spoke volumes. He believed her. But the man she was trying to save was not the man he appeared to be. As his mind processed the weight of her words, Zoe could feel the shift in the air. Everything had changed. Behind them, May was smiling. She had no idea that the 6 words Zoe had just whispered had unraveled her carefully constructed lies, that those words had set in motion a chain of events that would change their lives forever. But to understand why Zoe, just a 28-year-old nurse, balancing nursing school and grueling shifts, would risk everything to save a man she barely knew, to confront a woman who seemed untouchable, we need to go back. Back to 3 weeks ago, when everything began to spiral out of control. Welcome my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. Zoe's life had always been a delicate balancing act, teetering on the edge between exhaustion and accomplishment. It wasn't the kind of life that allowed room for mistakes, not with the relentless pursuit of her nurse practitioner degree hanging just 7 months away from completion. It wasn't the kind of life that allowed for distractions, not when every moment counted. Yet, here she was, on the edge of one of the biggest risks she'd ever face, a risk she hadn't planned for, an urge to save a man she barely knew. Zoe worked evenings at the quiet, upscale Laurelview Cardiac Recovery Center in Bethesda, Maryland, a private facility nestled between the sprawling estates of Georgetown and the vibrant Korean-American district of Northern Virginia. It was the kind of place where patients who valued discretion and luxury could receive care without the attention of the city's busy hospitals. The walls gleamed with polished marble, the rooms were spacious and serene, and the nurses like Zoe wore not just scrubs, but also the weight of unspoken expectations. Patients expected care and silence in return. For Zoe, it was a place where the high-end clientele came to heal in peace, away from the public eye. The work was straightforward, yet deeply important, monitoring the heart health of her patients and making sure that their treatment was going according to plan. But it was also a world that felt worlds apart from her own. A world of power brokers, trust fund babies, and high-end executives who lived in a world where money could buy privacy and health. At 28, Zoe had spent the last 6 years of her life getting to this point, balancing demanding night shifts, rigorous classes at Georgetown, and an internship at Washington Hospital Center, all while trying to put together a future that would provide for her mother and younger brother. Her mother worked overtime as a home health aide, just to make sure that Zoe had what she needed to continue her education. Zoe had been the hope of the family, her mother's dream that if she could finish school, they could rise above the constant struggle. The last 7 months were critical. After all this time, Zoe was just inches from her final graduation, the day that would mark the end of sleepless nights and long shifts, a day where she could finally give her family what they had sacrificed for. It was more than a degree. It was the chance to break free from the chains of their financial hardship. But nothing had prepared her for the quiet intrusion of a new patient, Jae Moon, a man whose presence would set the stage for a story Zoe could have never anticipated. It was early April when Jae first arrived at Laurelview. The air was still crisp with the remnants of winter, but the cherry blossoms outside the hospital windows hinted at the warmth to come. His paperwork stated he was 38, a businessman based in Georgetown. A man of wealth and stature, who'd been sent to the recovery center for routine cardiac monitoring. The chart showed stress-induced hypertension, a few early signs of heart failure, and prescribed medications, nothing too out of the ordinary for someone of his age and background. But when Zoe met Jae, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He wasn't like her usual patients. He didn't engage in the polite small talk she was accustomed to with others. His calmness was unsettling, as if he was always operating several layers beyond her. Then there was May, his fiancée. May was everything Zoe was not. Elegant, poised, with an air of effortless luxury that seemed to cling to her skin. Her designer outfits, perfectly groomed hair, and flawless makeup spoke of wealth and privilege, and her devotion to Jae was, on the surface, unwavering. She was always there with him, organizing his medications, adjusting his pillows, and managing every small detail of his care, as though she was the center of his world. Zoe had no reason to think otherwise, no reason to question what seemed like a perfect partnership. But as the weeks passed, Zoe noticed small things, subtle, almost imperceptible changes in Jae's health. His vitals should have been improving. The prescribed medications, beta blockers and ACE inhibitors, should have stabilized his blood pressure and relieved his heart strain. Yet, Jae's numbers were worsening. His heart rate variability increased, blood pressure was still climbing, and fatigue seemed to take a deeper hold of him. Zoe would have dismissed the gradual decline as a fluke, if not for the fact that she had been there for every single appointment, measuring every pulse, every beat, and every irregularity in his condition. She was trained to notice, and something didn't feel right. Over the course of the next 3 weeks, April 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th, Zoe tracked every change, every disturbing deviation from what should have been normal. Yet, the pattern was clear. Jae was getting worse, not better. That's when Zoe started reviewing Jae's medication log. It was meticulously kept, just as May always made sure it was. Beta blockers, ACE inhibitors, all the correct dosages, all administered at the right times. Everything looked perfect on paper. But Zoe couldn't shake the growing sense of dread in her stomach. Something wasn't right. Something was missing. She stayed late one evening, scrolling through toxicology reports and drug interactions on her phone, trying to make sense of it all. And then, like a light bulb flicking on in her mind, she found it. Digitalis, a class of cardiac glycosides used to treat heart conditions. A drug that could be incredibly dangerous if administered incorrectly, leading to fatal arrhythmias. Zoe didn't need a second look to recognize the symptoms in Jae's decline: the elevated blood pressure, the irregular heart rate, the increasing fatigue. Someone was poisoning him. Someone was using his own prescribed medication to kill him slowly. And that someone, it had to be May. She couldn't shake the weight of the discovery. The woman Jae trusted with his life, his fiancée, was poisoning him. The question now was, how could Zoe prove it without risking everything? Her career, her future, her life. What if she was wrong? What if it was just a bad reaction to the medication? What if the woman she suspected was just a devoted partner and not the villain in this twisted story? Zoe could only wait for the answer. The stakes were higher now. She couldn't go back. She couldn't unsee what she had discovered. Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you knew something was terribly wrong, but you were too afraid to speak up? Where you risked everything for someone else's safety? Let me know in the comments, because Zoe was about to face that exact dilemma, and what she decided to do next would change 2 lives forever. Zoe sat alone in her car, parked in the dimly lit lot outside the Laurelview Recovery Center. The dome light illuminated the cluttered dashboard, casting shadows across her face as she scrolled through toxicology reports, heart rate data, and medication logs on her phone. Her mind raced, piecing together the puzzle that she couldn't ignore any longer. The numbers weren't just wrong. They were deliberate. Zoe's fingers trembled slightly as she reread the list of symptoms. Jae's heart rate variability was increasing, his blood pressure climbing higher despite the medication. The fatigue, the tightness in his chest. It all matched one thing: digitalis poisoning. She had no doubt now. It wasn't an accident. May had been switching his medications, substituting his beta blockers with something else, something that would gradually destroy his heart. But Zoe couldn't understand why. May had seemed so devoted. Hadn't she been the perfect fiancée, the picture of caring and compassion? The woman who ensured everything was done right, with no detail too small for her attention? Zoe's heart pounded in her chest. Why would she do this? For hours, Zoe combed through patient logs, searched for anything that might give her an explanation. It wasn't until she reached for Jae's medication organizer, sitting neatly in a drawer in the nurse's station, that the final piece fell into place. It was late on a Thursday evening, almost midnight, when she made the decision. Zoe had been reviewing patient records as part of her regular shift when she spotted the familiar designer bag hanging by the door of the family lounge. May's bag. It was always there when May arrived for Jae's appointments. Zoe took a deep breath, steadying herself. She didn't have time to waste. If May was about to walk through that door, she needed evidence, real evidence, something she could hold in her hands. With swift, practiced movements, Zoe approached the leather handbag. Her pulse raced as she opened the zipper carefully. Inside, she found the medication organizer, a small, leather-bound planner with compartments labeled by days of the week. She pulled it out, her heart in her throat, knowing that every moment counted. Zoe slid open the compartment for today's date and froze. Inside were the pills she expected, but not all of them. The small white tablets that should have been Jae's prescribed beta blockers were missing, replaced by round yellow pills with a distinct imprint. The pills she found were consistent with the shape and color of digitalis. Her stomach twisted. Zoe had what she needed. The confirmation. The undeniable proof that May had been systematically poisoning Jae. But the weight of that discovery hit her harder than she expected. The woman Jae had trusted, the woman who had been by his side every step of the way, had been poisoning him, probably for weeks. Why? What kind of world had she stepped into? A world where love was nothing more than a currency and betrayal was just another weapon? The door to the family lounge clicked open, and Zoe quickly shoved the pills back into the compartment and zipped the bag shut. She took a step back, her heart pounding in her ears. May entered, her smile lighting up the room, like nothing was wrong, like she hadn't just been caught in a lie. Zoe didn't let the fear show. She smiled, greeted her, and proceeded with the routine checkup. But her mind was a whirlpool of questions, doubts, and fears. What was she going to do now? Zoe could no longer ignore the truth. She couldn't just turn a blind eye and pretend everything was fine. She had to act. But every move she made from here on out would change her life forever. The next step was dangerous. If she exposed May, she might not only lose her career, but also everything she had fought for. The degree, the future, the dream of finally helping her family. What if she was wrong? What if this was a mistake? The possibility of it being a mistake almost stopped Zoe. Almost. But then she thought of Jae, the man who was suffering right in front of her. The man whose life was slipping away while May sat, calm and collected, on the other side of the room. Zoe couldn't let this go. She had to warn him. Zoe could feel the tension rising in her chest as she sat at the nurse's station, pretending to focus on her paperwork, but her mind was somewhere else. May was still in the building, waiting for Jae's next appointment. Her every move felt calculated, deliberate, and Zoe couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was hiding something much darker than she had ever imagined. Over the next few days, Zoe couldn't stop thinking about the pills. The pills, the yellow tablets that were doing the slow, invisible damage to Jae's heart. Zoe had taken a picture of the pills on her phone, the evidence she needed, but the question that gnawed at her was, what now? If she confronted May directly, the consequences could be devastating. Zoe was just a nurse at the recovery center. What could she do against a woman like May? A woman who was already deeply embedded in Jae's life, a woman who seemed as untouchable as the world Jae himself moved in. The power, the danger, the secrets. Zoe felt a strange combination of fear and determination bubbling inside her. She had no idea how far this would go, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't walk away from the truth. She had to keep pushing, even if it meant exposing herself to a world that could destroy everything she had worked for. That night, after her shift, Zoe sat alone in her small apartment. The weight of the situation was heavy on her shoulders. She had to find a way to get through to Jae. But how? How could she warn him without risking her career, her future, her safety? Her fingers hovered over her phone as she scrolled through the contact list. She could go to her supervisor, but that would only make her look like a whistleblower, someone trying to stir up trouble. And if May had any connections, if she was as well placed as Zoe suspected, then going through official channels could make things even worse. Zoe closed her eyes, trying to focus. She needed another way. A safer way. Then, like a flash of insight, it hit her. May had been so meticulous about it, keeping everything perfectly in order, updating it with a devotion that bordered on obsessive. Zoe could use that. Use the very thing May had tried to manipulate to her advantage. If she could get a copy of the logs, she might find more discrepancies. She could track the changes, see if there were other signs, other patterns. The next day, Zoe stayed late after her shift. The center was quiet, almost eerily still, the soft hum of machinery the only sound in the air. She made her way to the nurse's station and, after a quick look over her shoulder, slid into the office where the patient files were stored. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for Jae's file, her fingers brushing against the cold paper. This was it. She needed this to be the final piece of the puzzle. The moment she opened the folder, Zoe felt a jolt of recognition. The medication logs were right where they should be, perfectly organized, carefully maintained. But it was what was written on the pages that stopped her in her tracks. The entries for Jae's medication were perfectly consistent with what May had been bringing in, until they weren't. Zoe's pulse quickened as she flipped through the pages. There were gaps, subtle adjustments in the dosages that hadn't been recorded properly. She saw it now. The yellow pills were listed in the logs under a different name. They weren't digitalis, but they were similar enough to mimic the effect of the medication Jae was supposed to be taking. Zoe's breath caught in her throat. May had been making the substitutions in the records, too. She had covered her tracks. But Zoe had the proof she needed now, proof that May was poisoning Jae not just physically, but also manipulating the documentation to make sure no one suspected her. Zoe stepped back, staring at the papers in disbelief. She had what she needed. This was it. But as Zoe stood there, clutching the medication logs, her mind raced. How could she confront May? How could she get through to Jae? And more importantly, how long did Jae have before the damage became irreversible? The weight of the moment hit her all at once. She was no longer just a nurse following protocols. She was part of something bigger now. A secret. A betrayal. A race against time. If she didn't act fast, if she didn't find a way to expose what was happening, it might already be too late for Jae. She was about to dive into a dangerous game. A game where the stakes weren't just her career or her education, they were life and death. If you were in Zoe's shoes, how far would you go to uncover the truth? Would you risk everything to expose a dangerous secret, even when the cost could be your future? Let me know in the comments, because Zoe was about to make a choice that would change everything, and the consequences would be far-reaching. Zoe could hardly sleep that night. The weight of what she'd uncovered pressed down on her chest, suffocating her in the quiet dark of her apartment. She had the proof. The medication logs. The pills. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. May had been poisoning Jae. And yet, something didn't add up. What was May's endgame? Why go to such lengths to slowly take Jae's life? For money? For power? It didn't make sense. May had seemed so devoted, so perfect. Zoe had been sure that she was simply a devoted fiancée, doing everything in her power to care for Jae. But now, that illusion had shattered. Zoe sat at her kitchen table, staring at the medication logs, the pills, the photos she had taken of the evidence. She had worked so hard for this, pouring every ounce of energy into uncovering the truth. But the closer she got to it, the more dangerous the situation became. She couldn't ignore it any longer. This wasn't just about Jae's life anymore. This was about her own life, too. Zoe had been operating under the assumption that once she exposed May, everything would fall into place. She could save Jae, get rid of the threat, and go back to her quiet life. But now, the possibility of facing retaliation from May, someone who seemed to have connections far beyond what Zoe had realized, made the stakes much higher. That was when Zoe received the call. It came just after dawn, just as she was about to get ready for another shift at Laurelview. "Zoe, it's Jae," the voice on the other end said, calm but urgent. Zoe's heart skipped a beat. The last time she had heard his voice, they had barely exchanged a few words. This time, he sounded different, focused, alert. There was a sharpness to his tone that made Zoe's blood run cold. "I need to meet with you," Jae continued. "In person. Can you do that? Now. It's important." Before she could answer, he hung up. Zoe was left staring at the phone in her hand, her mind racing. 1,000 thoughts rushed through her head. Was this a trap? Was he onto her? Or was he genuinely trying to understand what was happening? Was it possible he knew the truth about May? Zoe's instincts told her she had no choice but to meet him. She had to know what Jae had figured out. Was he aware of what was happening to him? Had May told him anything? What did he want to discuss? She met Jae at a quiet cafe in downtown Bethesda, a place far removed from the watchful eyes of the recovery center. When she saw him, sitting at a corner table, it struck her how much he had changed in just a few weeks. His usual composure was replaced with a nervous energy. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his usually immaculate suit looked slightly wrinkled, as though he had been through a storm. "Thank you for meeting me," Jae said, his voice low and measured. "I know you must have questions, but I'm afraid I'm the one with the questions now." Zoe took a seat across from him, her pulse racing. She tried to keep her expression neutral, but inside, she was on edge. "I've been doing some digging," Jae continued, his eyes not leaving hers. "About the medication, about May." Zoe's breath caught. He knew. "I know what she's been doing," he said, leaning forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I know it's not just her. There's more to this. More than what you think." Zoe's world stopped for a moment. What was he saying? More than May? Jae's eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made Zoe's skin crawl. "I'm not just some businessman," he said, his voice steady now. "I'm not just some man with a heart condition. I've been part of something much bigger. Something dangerous. And May, she's not the one calling the shots." Zoe's heart raced as she tried to absorb what he was saying. Everything she had believed about Jae, about the relationship between him and May, was starting to crumble. Jae wasn't just an innocent man caught in a toxic relationship. He was a player in something darker, something that had been going on for years. "What are you talking about?" Zoe whispered, leaning in, her mind spinning. Jae sighed, rubbing his temple as though he were trying to find the words. "May was sent to me," he said. "Sent by people who've been watching me, manipulating me. They're the ones who put her in my life. The ones who made her do what she did. They needed me dead." Zoe felt her stomach drop. "Who?" she asked, her voice shaking. Jae leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. "I can't tell you everything right now, but I can tell you this. May wasn't working alone. She's just a pawn, just like me." Zoe felt a chill run through her body. The idea that May had been just one piece of a much larger puzzle sent her mind into overdrive. The stakes had changed in an instant. She wasn't dealing with a simple betrayal of trust anymore. This wasn't just about May and Jae. This was about something far more dangerous, something involving a network of people who had been manipulating both of them for reasons Zoe couldn't even begin to comprehend. Jae's voice softened as he continued. The people who wanted me gone, who forced May into this, they didn't care about her. They didn't care about me. All they cared about was one thing, taking control of my business. They've been working from the shadows for months, and now they've pushed May into a position where she's been forced to kill me, slowly, without anyone noticing. They'll stop at nothing to get what they want. Zoe could hardly process what he was saying. This was bigger than she'd imagined. He took a deep breath. I need your help, Zoe. I need to take them down. But to do that, I need you to keep playing the game. Keep pretending everything is normal. Don't confront May. Don't go to anyone in the hospital. It'll make everything worse. He looked at her with a fierce determination. I'm going to use the information you've gathered, but we need to do this carefully. If we're going to survive this, we have to stay one step ahead. Zoe sat there in stunned silence. She had been so sure of her plan, so certain that she had the truth on her side. But now, Jae's words were turning everything upside down. Who could she trust? Was May really the mastermind behind this, or was she just another victim in a far larger game? How could Zoe help Jae, when she wasn't even sure who the enemy was? Zoe couldn't remember the last time she had felt this lost. The days that followed her meeting with Jae were a blur of confusion, fear, and uncertainty. What had seemed like a clear path forward, exposing May's betrayal and saving Jae, had turned into a chaotic web of deception that Zoe wasn't sure she could escape. She had kept her distance from Jae in the days after their conversation, even though her heart ached with the desire to help him. Jae had asked her to stay in the shadows, to pretend nothing had changed, and she had no choice but to follow his instructions. But each day, the weight of the secret grew heavier, as if the burden of knowing the truth was eating away at her from the inside out. May had been more cordial than ever during their recent encounters. It was as if she had no idea that Zoe was onto her, that the woman who had been standing in the shadows of Jae's life was now being hunted by the very truth she had tried so hard to conceal. Zoe had almost believed the facade, almost convinced herself that everything was normal. But every time Zoe looked at May, her perfect smile, her graceful gestures, she felt a growing sense of dread. Was she really that dangerous? Was she really capable of killing someone she loved? Or had Zoe misunderstood everything? And then came the phone call. It was late on a Saturday night when the number popped up on Zoe's screen. The caller ID read, Laurelview Recovery Center. Zoe's stomach turned. She hadn't been expecting any calls. Not after the scene she'd caused last week when she confronted her supervisor about the medication logs. Her supervisor's voice crackled through the line when she answered. Zoe, we need you to come in. Now. There's been an incident. Her heart sank. What kind of incident? It's Jae, the supervisor said. He's collapsed. His heart stopped. We're trying to revive him now, but... Zoe's breath caught in her throat, and for a long moment, she couldn't speak. She could hear the beeping of medical equipment in the background. The emergency room. The sound of a life hanging by a thread. No, Zoe whispered. No, this can't be happening. She slammed the phone down and rushed to the hospital, her hands trembling on the wheel as she drove through the empty streets. All she could think about was the image of Jae lying motionless in that hospital room. Had it happened? Had May gone too far? Had the poison finally taken its toll? When Zoe arrived, the ER was buzzing with activity. Nurses and doctors rushed past her, their faces grim. She made her way to Jae's room, where she found May standing by the bed, her eyes blank as if she were in shock. The look on her face was not the panic Zoe had expected, but something colder, more controlled. Zoe could see the faintest tremor in her hands, but otherwise, May appeared as calm as ever. Is he... Zoe began, her voice thick with fear, but May interrupted her with a hollow smile. He's stable for now, May said softly. But I don't think he's going to make it. Zoe stepped into the room, trying to keep her emotions in check. She forced herself to look at Jae, lying unconscious on the bed. He was pale, his heart rate weak, barely hanging on. The beeping monitor was a reminder of how close he was to death. Zoe's mind raced. Could this be it? Was this the end for him? And what did it mean for her? Had she failed him? Had she done everything she could? May's voice broke through her thoughts. "I should have known," she murmured, her eyes never leaving Jae. "I should have realized he was too stubborn to just let go. He always has to be in control. Always. Even now, he's trying to fight it." Zoe froze, her breath catching in her chest. "I should have known," May had said. That didn't sound like someone who was simply a concerned fiancé. That sounded like someone who had been involved in this from the start. "May," Zoe began, her voice shaking. "What did you do?" May didn't look at her, but Zoe could see the shift in her expression. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, something darker than Zoe had ever seen. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," May whispered. "But he didn't listen. He never listens." Zoe's heart pounded in her chest. "What did you do?" she repeated, her voice now trembling with the weight of the accusation. And then May turned toward her, and for the first time, Zoe saw the woman's true face. The cold, calculating eyes. The mask of devotion slipped, revealing the truth beneath. "He was never supposed to survive," May said, her voice low, almost sad. "Not after everything he's done." Zoe's world shattered in that moment. May hadn't just been poisoning Jae out of some twisted sense of love or control. She had been trying to kill him from the very start. This wasn't a slow betrayal. It was cold, calculated murder, disguised as devotion. Zoe's legs gave out, and she stumbled back against the wall, her head spinning. "No, no. You're lying. You have to be lying." But May's expression was unwavering. He was never going to change. He's a part of something much bigger. People like him don't get to live happily ever after. Zoe felt her heart drop into her stomach. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Everything she had believed about Jae, about the situation, was a lie. She had been part of a much darker game than she could have ever imagined. "Zoe, I didn't have a choice," May continued, her voice growing more desperate. "You have no idea what he's done. No idea what they'll do to me when they find out I failed." Zoe couldn't listen to any more of her lies. The truth was clear now. May had never been a victim. She had never loved Jae. She had been a pawn, a willing participant in a deadly game. And now, Zoe had no idea what to do next. Her thoughts were drowned by the beeping of the machines, the soft sounds of life slowly slipping away. Jae's life hung by a thread, and everything Zoe had worked for, everything she had fought for, seemed pointless now. The weight of the situation, the weight of failure, crushed her. Had she made the right choices? Had she been wrong to trust Jae? Was it all a mistake? Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt like everything was slipping through your fingers, and the choices you made started to feel like they didn't matter anymore? How would you find the strength to keep fighting when everything seems lost? Let me know in the comments, because Zoe's world has just fallen apart, and she's facing a crisis that could change everything. Zoe had never felt more alone in her life. The weight of the situation was suffocating. Jae was still clinging to life, and May's revelation had shattered everything Zoe thought she knew. Every decision she had made up until this point felt like it had led her here, to this moment of failure and uncertainty. But as Zoe sat there in the sterile hospital room, staring at Jae's still form, something inside her began to shift. She wasn't done. She couldn't be. The bitter taste of betrayal still lingered on her tongue, and the overwhelming sense of guilt threatened to swallow her whole. How could she have let it get this far? How could she have believed in Jae, in May, when all along the truth had been staring her in the face? But deep down, Zoe knew that staying in this pit of self-doubt wouldn't save Jae. It wouldn't save her. And it sure as hell wouldn't undo the damage May had caused. In that moment of stillness, Zoe remembered something her mother had told her when she was a little girl, a simple piece of advice that had always stayed with her: when you can't fix something, you fight for the parts you can. She clenched her fists, feeling the cold steel of resolve begin to form in her chest. She couldn't fix everything, but she could fight for Jae's life. Zoe stood up, her legs shaky at first, but as she moved toward the door, something inside her solidified. She had no more time for indecision. It was time to act. She pulled out her phone, her hands steady now, as she dialed the one number she had been avoiding, the number that could finally give her the answers she needed. "Jae," she said when he picked up, her voice clear and purposeful. "I'm going to save you. But we need to get ahead of this. We need a plan." There was silence on the other end, and Zoe could hear Jae's labored breathing through the phone. But then his voice came through, weak but unwavering. "I knew you'd come through for me," he said, his words laced with gratitude and fear. "What do we do?" "I have evidence," Zoe replied, her heart pounding in her chest. "But we need more. We need to expose them, all of them. I know you've been part of something bigger. Now it's time to stop being a pawn in this game." She took a deep breath, rallying the last of her strength. "Meet me at the recovery center in 2 hours. I'll have everything ready." Zoe's pulse quickened as she hung up. She had made a decision. She wasn't going to let Jae die. Not now, not when there was still a chance to stop this madness. The next few hours felt like an eternity as Zoe worked with surgical precision, gathering the evidence she needed to confront May and the people behind her. She reviewed everything once more: the medication logs, the photos, the records she had hidden away in her car. She was ready now, ready to expose the truth and put an end to this twisted game once and for all. When Jae finally arrived at the center, looking more frail than she had ever seen him, Zoe was already in action. She knew she had to be quick. Every moment they wasted brought him closer to death. And every second counted. "Zoe," Jae whispered as he stepped into the small, dimly lit office she had prepared for their confrontation. His eyes were bloodshot, his body weak, but his resolve was unmistakable. "We do this now." Zoe didn't waste any time. She handed Jae the folders she had prepared, all the evidence they would need to bring down the people who had orchestrated his downfall. As she spoke, every word was laced with a quiet determination. "They've been tracking us, manipulating us both. May was just the tip of the iceberg. But now, we've got what we need. I've gathered everything. I'll go to the authorities if I have to. But we're going to make sure this stops here." Jae's eyes flicked over the documents, his face paling as the full scope of the situation sank in. "You're risking everything for me," he said softly. "Why?" Zoe met his gaze, her voice calm but strong. "Because I made a promise to myself. I don't stand by and watch people die when I can save them. No matter who they are. No matter how dangerous it gets." The fear that had been gnawing at her insides slowly began to fade. In that moment, Zoe knew she was doing the right thing. She was no longer just a passive observer in a dangerous game. She was an active participant in taking it all down. Jae leaned forward, his expression softening. "You're right. We don't wait any longer. Let's end this." With a deep breath, Zoe moved to the computer and began to type. Her fingers flew over the keyboard as she made the final adjustments to the evidence: surveillance footage, bank records, contacts, the conspiracy that had been quietly orchestrating Jae's death. She was setting the stage for a confrontation that would change everything. As Zoe finished compiling everything, she finally turned to Jae. "It's time." Together, they prepared to confront May. Together, they would expose everything. But as Zoe walked toward the door, ready to face the woman who had poisoned Jae's life, she felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just about saving Jae anymore. It was about reclaiming her own life. She had been trapped in fear, in guilt, in the weight of her past decisions. But now, standing on the edge of everything she had worked for, Zoe knew she had found the strength to change the narrative. She wasn't just going to watch from the sidelines anymore. She was going to take control. For the first time in a long time, Zoe felt truly alive. Have you ever had a moment where you felt like everything was falling apart, but then found the strength to keep going? How did you turn things around, and what made you fight back when it felt like all was lost? Let me know in the comments, because Zoe is about to face the biggest challenge of her life, and the consequences will be nothing short of life-changing. The air inside the Laurelview Recovery Center was thick with tension as Zoe stood in front of the door to May's office. Every muscle in her body was tight, her heartbeat drumming in her chest as she felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She was about to confront May, the woman who had nearly destroyed Jae's life, and her own, and she knew there was no turning back. Jae stood beside her, his presence a steady force, though the toll on his body was evident. His skin was pale, his breathing shallow, but there was fire in his eyes. He wasn't the same man who had walked into the hospital weeks ago. Now he was ready to fight. They exchanged a brief look, one that said everything. Zoe was no longer just trying to save him. They were in this together. Whatever happened next, they would face it as one. Zoe knocked on the door, her hand trembling only slightly. The seconds felt like hours as they waited for a response. "Come in," May's voice called from the other side. Zoe pushed open the door. May was sitting at her desk, her back to them, as if she hadn't a care in the world. The moment she turned to face them, her expression froze. The pleasant smile that always seemed to linger on her lips faltered, and for the first time, Zoe saw fear flicker in May's eyes. "Jae," May said, her voice a little too calm. "I didn't expect you to be up already." Her gaze shifted to Zoe, then back to Jae, and for a split second, Zoe thought she saw something like regret. But it was fleeting, quickly replaced by the cold, calculated expression that Zoe had become so familiar with. "May," Jae said, his voice surprisingly steady despite the weakness in his body. "It's time we had a conversation." Zoe stepped forward, standing beside him, her spine straight. "May, we know what you've been doing. The poison, the manipulation, the lies." May's face remained impassive, though a tremor in her hand betrayed the composure she had been struggling to maintain. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice smooth, though there was a slight crack in it now. Zoe didn't flinch. "You've been poisoning Jae for weeks. We have the evidence, the medication logs, the photos, the records. We know exactly what you've been doing." Jae stepped closer, his eyes hard. "You thought you could take me down slowly, piece by piece. But I'm not going down without a fight, May. And you're not walking away from this." For a moment, May said nothing. She stood there, frozen, as if the weight of the truth was sinking in. Her perfect facade was crumbling, and she couldn't hide it anymore. "I did what I had to do," May said quietly, almost as if she were trying to convince herself. "You don't understand. You've always been a part of something bigger, something dangerous. People like us don't get to have happy endings. You should have known that from the beginning." Zoe's heart raced. So it was true. May hadn't just been playing her part as Jae's fiancée, she had been forced into it. Jae's eyes darkened. "You're right about one thing," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I've been part of something bigger. But not anymore. I'm done being your pawn. I'm done being their pawn." Zoe felt the truth settle in her chest. Jae was no longer the man who had been caught in the web of this dangerous world. He was ready to fight back, and now he had Zoe by his side. Together, they could expose everything. "You may have thought you could control me," Jae continued, "but this ends today. You'll never hurt anyone again." May's eyes flicked to the door as if she were considering running, but she knew it was pointless. Zoe could see the panic rising in her, her composure slipping. But Zoe wasn't done. She pulled out the evidence: photographs, digital files, medical records, and the recordings that had taken weeks to collect. It was undeniable. "I've already made sure the authorities are on their way," Zoe said, her voice steady, though every fiber of her being screamed for action. "There's nothing left to hide. The truth is coming for you, May." For a moment, May seemed to crumble. She slumped into the chair behind her desk, her face pale, the weight of everything she had done crashing down on her. "No one will care," May whispered, her voice breaking. "The people who I answer to, they'll protect me. They'll make sure I'm safe. You're just a nurse. What can you do?" Zoe's gaze hardened. "We'll see about that." She knew May's words weren't empty threats. The people May had been working with were dangerous, powerful. But now that the truth was out, Zoe wasn't backing down. Just then, the door to the office opened, and two plainclothes officers entered, the weight of authority in their stride. Zoe didn't flinch. She knew this was the moment that everything would change. The officers looked at Zoe and Jae first, then at May, who sat frozen in her chair. "Ma'am," one of the officers said, his voice firm, "you're under arrest for the attempted murder of Jae Moon. You have the right to remain silent." Zoe stood there, watching as May was handcuffed, her face a mask of disbelief. The woman who had tried to take Jae's life was finally being held accountable for her actions. But it wasn't over. This wasn't just about one person's betrayal, it was about a much larger network, a web of corruption that had affected far too many. This was just the beginning. Zoe turned to Jae, who was watching the officers lead May away. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something like relief, but also something deeper, something that told Zoe he wasn't the same man who had come to Laurelview weeks ago. "Thank you," Jae said quietly, "for believing in me when no one else did." Zoe nodded, her heart swelling with something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The days after May's arrest were a blur for Zoe. It felt like the weight of the world had been lifted off her shoulders, but also like a new, unpredictable future was unfolding before her. The investigation was still ongoing, and the authorities were working to unravel the full scope of the network that May had been involved with. Zoe had given her statements, provided her evidence, and answered questions, but now she could only watch from the sidelines as the pieces fell into place. Jae was still recovering from the poison, though his condition had improved significantly now that he was no longer under May's influence. It would take time for his body to heal fully, but the doctors were confident that he would be okay. His heart was finally free from the toxic grip that had nearly killed him. As the days passed, Zoe couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. She had risked everything, her career, her future, to save a man she barely knew. And now, as the dust settled, she found herself standing at the crossroads of her own life, unsure of what the next step would be. It was a Tuesday evening when Jae showed up at Laurelview Recovery Center once again. Zoe had been working late, finishing up some reports when she heard the soft knock at her office door. When she looked up, she was surprised to see him standing there, a small, thoughtful smile on his face. "I wasn't sure you'd be here tonight," Zoe said, setting down her pen. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Jae said, his voice steady but softer than usual. "But I think you already knew that." Zoe smiled, leaning back in her chair. "Well, I did kind of help save your life." Jae chuckled, but there was a seriousness to his gaze as he stepped closer. "You did more than that. You helped me see the truth. Not just about the people who wanted to hurt me, but about myself. About the life I've been living. And that's something I'll never forget." Zoe's heart swelled with something she hadn't felt in a long time: gratitude. She had always believed in the power of small actions, in the quiet ways people could change the world for the better. But saving Jae had changed her, too. She had found her courage in the face of danger, her strength when everything seemed lost. Jae walked over to the desk, pausing before her. I've been thinking a lot about my next steps. I don't know if you're interested, but I'd like to offer you something. Zoe raised an eyebrow, unsure of what he meant. Offer me something? I'm transitioning my business operations, Jae said, his tone serious. I want to move away from the shadows, from all the dangerous connections I've been involved with. I want to build something legitimate, something good, and I need someone who can help guide that transition. Someone with integrity. Someone who knows how to take care of people. Zoe blinked, surprised. You're asking me to, work with you? Jae nodded. I'm not asking you to jump in right away, but I trust you, and I believe in what you can do. You've already saved my life once. I think you're someone who could help me save a lot more. Zoe felt a knot tighten in her chest. This was it. The moment she had been dreading. She had always known that Jae was part of a dangerous world, but now it was clear that he wanted out. Was she willing to take that step with him? For the first time in a long time, Zoe realized something. It wasn't about the offer or the money or the career. It was about purpose. What she had done for Jae wasn't just about saving a life. It was about creating a future that was built on trust, on truth, on real change. I'll think about it, Zoe said, her voice steady but filled with resolve. But right now, I think there's something else I need to focus on. Jae tilted his head, waiting for her to continue. I'm finishing my nurse practitioner degree, Zoe explained, her eyes meeting his. I've worked for this for 6 years, and I'm not walking away from it now. Not when I'm so close. Jae nodded, a look of understanding in his eyes. I get it. I wouldn't ask you to. But after that, Zoe continued, I think it's time for me to decide what I really want to do. And maybe that means helping you. Maybe that means building something together. But I need to make sure that it's the right path for me. Jae smiled, a genuine, relieved smile. Take your time. No pressure. Whatever you decide, I'll support it. You've already done more than I could ever repay. Zoe stood up and walked around the desk to him. For a moment, they just stood there, facing each other. It wasn't the kind of moment that required words. It was the kind of moment that spoke volumes just in the shared silence. As Zoe looked at Jae, she realized that the decision she had been so afraid to make, about trusting him, about stepping into his world, hadn't been about him at all. It had been about her. She had learned something important through this journey. She had the power to choose her path. And the courage to walk it. Jae placed his hand on her shoulder gently, his voice soft. Whatever happens, Zoe, I'm glad you're in my life. Zoe smiled back, a warmth filling her chest. Me too. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.